Welcome to Official Bible Stories. The evening air was cool as young Malachi sat on the rocky hillside overlooking his village. A gentle breeze stirred the branches of the olive trees that dotted the landscape, their silver leaves catching the last light of the setting sun. Below him, nestled in the valley, lay the scattered houses of his people, the Israelites who had returned from exile in Babylon. Though they were home, it was a fractured and somber homecoming, and Malachi could sense that the soul of Israel was weary, uncertain, and broken. Malachi was no stranger to the stories of his ancestors. His father and grandfather had been storytellers of a sort, keeping the history of their people alive through tales told around the fire. They had spoken of Moses and the deliverance from Egypt, of King David and Solomon, who built the first magnificent temple. They recounted tales of God's prophets, men and women who had spoken directly to the people with a power and conviction that echoed through the ages. But Malachi knew that the days of greatness were long past. The temple that once held God's presence, the very heart of Israel, had been destroyed by the Babylonians. It had been rebuilt, yes, but not with the same grandeur or the same divine fire. To many, it seemed merely a symbol of past glories, a faded reminder of Israel's covenant with God, which now felt distant and uncertain. And it was not just the temple. It was the people, too, who had changed. The sacrifices, once offered with reverence and joy, had become mere routines. The fervent prayers and songs of gratitude had grown muted, barely a whisper of the powerful faith that once filled the nation. As he sat in silence, Malachi felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the ache of a people who had once known intimacy with God and had now drifted into hollow rituals and half-hearted worship. He knew many of the people brought offerings that were less than what was required, animals that were sickly or deformed, sacrifices given out of obligation rather than reverence. And the priests, who were meant to be the leaders and spiritual guides, seemed to accept these offerings without question, as though they, too, were simply going through the motions. They were caretakers of God's altar, but their hearts seemed as cold as the stone they served upon. Malachi's parents had taught him to honor the traditions and to revere the God of Israel, yet he could not shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. The stories he had grown up with painted a picture of a God who was fierce in love, who demanded justice and compassion, and who took delight in the worship of his people. But the God Malachi knew from these stories seemed a far cry from the reality he saw each day. Despite the darkness that hung over the land, there was a spark within Malachi, a quiet but unyielding desire for something more, a yearning for the God he had heard so much about but never truly experienced himself. He would often sit under the stars, pondering the mysteries of the universe, wondering if the God of his ancestors still watched over them, still cared for them. Sometimes, he even whispered prayers into the night, asking questions that had no answers, hoping that, somehow, his words would reach beyond the vastness of the sky and touch the heart of the Creator. On one particular evening, Malachi's thoughts drifted back to the stories of the prophets. He thought of Elijah, who had stood alone on Mount Carmel, calling down fire from heaven in the face of opposition and disbelief. He thought of Isaiah, who had seen a vision of the Lord in the temple, high and lifted up, with seraphim crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty." Malachi wondered what it must have been like to have such a powerful encounter with God, to hear his voice with such clarity that there was no doubt, no hesitation, only obedience. But that was the past. Now, Israel was a shadow of its former self. Though they had been allowed to return to their homeland, they were still under the watchful eyes of foreign rulers. Persia controlled the land, and while the Israelites were permitted to live and worship freely, there was a constant reminder that they were not truly free. It was a strange existence living in the land of promise, but feeling as though that promise had somehow been broken or forgotten. Malachi noticed this tension everywhere he went. In the marketplace, he heard merchants grumbling about the weight of taxes imposed by foreign rulers. He saw farmers struggling with poor harvests and families wrestling with poverty, some of them resorting to dishonest means just to survive. Greed and exploitation seemed to be seeping into the fabric of their society. In the temple, too, he saw corruption creeping in. Priests who were supposed to serve selflessly had become indifferent, more interested in maintaining their positions than in fostering a genuine connection between God and the people. As he reflected on this, Malachi felt a stirring deep within him, a mixture of sorrow and anger, a sense of frustration that gnawed at his heart. "Why?" he whispered to the night. "Why have we strayed so far? Why have we forgotten the one who brought us out of Egypt, who guided us through the wilderness, who gave us this land as an inheritance?" He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted to understand his place in this story. He wanted to know if there was any hope for his people, any way to restore what had been lost. In his soul, he sensed that God was still present, though hidden, watching and waiting for his people to return to him with sincere hearts. He wondered if perhaps God had chosen this moment, this generation, to bring about a new beginning, to reignite the flame of devotion and justice in Israel's heart. But how would that happen? Who would lead the way? Malachi couldn't help but feel that somehow, in some way, he was meant to be part of this journey. The thought both excited and terrified him. He had no desire for glory or recognition, no ambition to be a leader or a prophet. But the vision of a restored Israel, a land where God's presence was once again honored, where justice and mercy were the pillars of society, was one he could not let go of. As the stars began to emerge, filling the sky with their quiet brilliance, Malachi felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Perhaps, he thought, the darkness was not as absolute as it seemed. Perhaps there was still a glimmer of hope, a faint light that could guide them back to God. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was meant to be a small part of that light, a voice calling out in the wilderness of a disillusioned people, urging them to remember, to repent, and to return. For now, he would wait, listening for the voice of the Almighty, trusting that, in time, he would understand his purpose. Malachi's life changed forever on a night when the sky seemed impossibly vast and endless, as though the heavens were straining to reveal something hidden just beyond his sight. He had wandered to his favorite spot on the hillside, far from the noise of the village and the hum of everyday worries. Here, with only the stars for company, he felt closer to the mystery of life, closer to the God he had learned about from the stories his family told, yet who still seemed so distant. He sat there in the silence, eyes closed, inhaling the earthy scent of the grass and the cool night air. His heart was troubled by all he had seen and felt recently, the brokenness of his people, the coldness in the temple, the priests who seemed to go through the motions with little love or reverence. He had no power to change any of it, yet he could not silence the longing in his soul for something more. He wanted to see God's light shine once more in Israel, to feel the fire of his presence touch the hearts of his people. Malachi whispered a prayer into the night. "Lord, where are you? Have you left us? Have we fallen so far that even your mercy cannot reach us?" His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, but he let them flow. "We are lost, like sheep without a shepherd. Show us the way back. Show me what I am meant to do." And then, something happened. A deep stillness descended upon him, a silence so profound that he felt his breath catch in his throat. The air around him grew heavy, charged with a strange energy that prickled his skin and made his heart pound. He felt a presence, powerful and immense, unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as though the very ground beneath him and the heavens above were trembling with anticipation. He opened his eyes, and though he was awake, he saw a vision forming before him. The stars seemed to rearrange themselves, their light coalescing into shapes and figures that he could not understand at first. Then, slowly, an image began to emerge, a mighty figure standing before a blazing altar, surrounded by fire and light. The figure's presence was overwhelming, both terrifying and beautiful, radiating an authority that filled Malachi with awe. A voice spoke, resonant and deep, yet somehow soft and gentle. It was a voice that seemed to pierce through every layer of Malachi's soul, laying bare his innermost thoughts and desires. "Malachi," the voice said, "Son of Israel, why do you cry out in despair? Have you forgotten that I am the Lord, the God of your fathers, the one who delivered your people from slavery and made a covenant with you?" Malachi trembled, but he forced himself to respond, his voice barely a whisper. "No, Lord, I have not forgotten. But I see our people lost, straying from your ways. The priests are indifferent. The people bring offerings that are unworthy, and your temple lies in shadow. I fear we are too far gone. The voice replied, full of a sadness.